What makes a place forbidden? Sometimes it is danger, sometimes reverence, sometimes the quiet decision that certain doors should remain closed, not because nothing is there, but because what waits behind them may be too fragile, too powerful, or too difficult to fully understand. Across the world, there are landscapes and chambers most of us will never enter. A stone arch in Europe, slowly surrendering to time. A vault in the Arctic, built to outlast catastrophe. A hidden shrine where silence is guarded like a living thing. Beneath ice, beneath mountains, beneath centuries of ritual and secrecy, these places endure in a strange category between map and myth. We know they exist. We know they matter. And still, we are asked to stop at the threshold. That tension is deeply human. We are a species shaped by curiosity. We cross oceans, split atoms, climb into space, and lower cameras into darkness simply because we need to know what lies beyond the next ridge, the next wall, the next locked gate. Yet history has also taught us that access is not always wisdom. Some places are closed to protect us from what they contain, others are protected from us. So this is not only a story about restricted destinations, it is a story about limits, about what civilizations choose to preserve, what they fear losing, and what they believe should remain untouched. In every age, forbidden places have reflected the values of the people who guard them: fear, faith, memory, survival. Each locked boundary tells us something about ourselves. And perhaps that is the deeper mystery. When a place is sealed off from ordinary eyes, does it become more important or simply more revealing? Because sometimes the most hidden places on Earth are not hiding treasure at all. They are hiding a question we have never stopped asking. How much of the world are we truly meant to see? What if the first forbidden place is not a fortress or a vault, but a piece of beauty slowly disappearing in plain sight? In the northwestern reaches of the Czech Republic, the forested region known as Bohemian Switzerland rises in folds of stone and mist. There, above dark pines and winding ravines, a sandstone arch stretches across the sky with the effortless grace of something ancient and temporary at once. Pravchika Brana does not look engineered. It looks discovered by time itself, as if wind and rain had been sketching it for centuries until the shape finally held. For years, people were allowed to walk across it. Travelers came for the view, for the thrill of standing on a monument that seemed too delicate to bear human weight, and yet somehow always had. Beneath their footsteps, though, the arch was changing. Sandstone is beautiful because it yields so easily to the elements. That is also what makes it vulnerable. Every season carved a little more from its surface, and every visitor added something invisible but real to the strain. Eventually, authorities made a decision that must have felt disappointing, even excessive, to some. No one would be allowed on the arch anymore. The ban was not meant to turn the place into a mystery. It was meant to keep wonder from becoming ruin. Visitors can still look up at it from below, can still photograph it framed by branches and drifting light, but they must remain at a respectful distance. There is something quietly profound in that boundary. We often imagine preservation as rescue, as though enough rules and enough care can save something forever. But some things cannot be saved forever. They can only be given more time: a season, a generation, a few more years of standing against the sky. And maybe that is enough. Maybe love is not always possession. Maybe sometimes it is restraint. To admire without touching, to leave a thing unclaimed, to accept that the world contains forms of beauty so fragile that the kindest human act is simply to step back. What would humanity save if it knew winter was coming for the entire world? Far above the familiar routes of ordinary travel, on a Norwegian island edged by ice and silence, a tunnel disappears into a mountain. The landscape around it feels almost lunar. White slopes, hard wind, a sky that can seem endless and indifferent. At the end of that tunnel sits one of the least dramatic and most important collections on Earth. Not gold, not weapons, not art. Seeds. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault was built for a future no one wants to witness. Its purpose is both simple and enormous: to preserve the genetic memory of the crops that feed civilization. Rice, wheat, barley, beans, maize. Varieties gathered from nations across the world, including some already vanishing from fields and markets. Inside cold chambers, these seeds rest in darkness like messages addressed to a damaged tomorrow. There is something moving about the humility of that idea. The vault does not promise to stop war, climate disruption, famine, or political collapse. It only offers a second chance after the damage is done. It is a place designed by people who understand that progress is fragile and that survival may depend less on invention than on remembering what we once knew how to grow. The public is not welcomed beyond its threshold. Access is tightly controlled, and withdrawals are meant for extraordinary circumstances. Yet even from a distance, the vault tells a larger story. It reveals a strange paradox of modern life. The more advanced our systems become, the more we recognize how vulnerable they are. Behind all our technology, human life still leans on soil, weather, water, and seed. And there is another irony buried in the mountain. A vault built to defend against catastrophe has itself had to reckon with a warming world. The future it was meant to insure against is no longer theoretical. It has already begun to press at the door. So perhaps the real power of this place is not what it stores, but what it admits. That civilization is not permanent, that abundance is not guaranteed, and that sometimes the wisest expression of hope is not confidence, but preparation. Why do some sacred places become more powerful precisely because they cannot be seen? In Japan, where shrines appear in cities, forests, and roadside clearings, spiritual space is often woven gently into everyday life. But in Mi Prefecture, the grand shrine of Issei occupies a different kind of silence. It is not simply admired, it is revered. Hidden behind layers of wooden fencing and shaded by tall trees, it remains just beyond the reach of ordinary sight, as if mystery itself were part of the architecture. The shrine is dedicated to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, a figure whose presence has shaped centuries of Japanese spiritual imagination. Yet what makes Issei so extraordinary is not only who it honors, but how it endures. Every 20 years, the shrine is rebuilt from the ground up using traditional techniques that have been handed down across generations. Timber is cut, joints are fitted, forms are repeated with meticulous care. The structure is renewed, but the design remains. It dies and returns. It vanishes and continues. To modern eyes, that practice can seem almost paradoxical. We often treat age as proof of authenticity, as though the original object matters more than the living tradition behind it. East suggests something else. It proposes that continuity may not live in material permanence at all, but in faithful repetition, in memory carried by hands, tools, and ritual. Only a very small circle is permitted into the innermost sanctuary. Priests, members of the imperial family. Everyone else stops outside the barriers, left to contemplate a holiness that remains deliberately obscured. And perhaps that is the point. The unseen center asks visitors to accept that not everything meaningful must be fully visible to be real. There is a quiet lesson in that restraint. In an age that documents everything and reveals everything instantly, Issei preserves another rhythm, one built on patience, reverence, and distance. It reminds us that mystery is not always ignorance. Sometimes it is a form of respect. And perhaps that is why places like this endure. Not because they resist time, but because they teach us how to stand before something we cannot possess and still feel illuminated by it. What if an entrance to the underworld turned out to be real, just not in the way the ancients imagined? In the ruins of Hierapolis, in what is now Turkey, there is a place where myth once leaned so closely against reality that the difference almost disappeared. The ancients called it Pluto's gate. To them, it was an opening into the realm of the dead, a sacred and terrible threshold where invisible forces could kill without warning. Accounts from the time describe animals collapsing near the cave mouth, overcome by something no one could see. Priests appeared to enter and emerge alive, strengthening the belief that divine favor alone could survive what lived there. For centuries, these stories sounded like the language of ritual, symbolic, exaggerated, shaped by fear and faith. But the earth, as it often does, kept its own explanation waiting beneath the legend. The cave sits atop a fault line that releases heavy concentrations of carbon dioxide through cracks in the stone. Because the gas is denser than air, it settles close to the ground in lethal layers. Small animals, breathing low to the earth, would suffocate quickly. A person kneeling or lingering too near could do the same. The old terror, it turns out, was not invented. It was observed. Myth became the first vocabulary for a danger science would later describe with instruments and measurements. What the ancients attributed to Pluto was, in another sense, the breath of geology itself. Today, access to the area is restricted, and for good reason. The danger remains, even if the story has changed. But that change is worth dwelling on. We often imagine that knowledge replaces mystery, as if a scientific explanation drains wonder from a place. Yet sometimes the opposite happens. Understanding the mechanism does not erase the awe, it simply relocates it. Because there is something deeply humbling in realizing that ancient people were not always naive. Sometimes they were responding, as we do, to the edge of what they could perceive. They named the unknown with the language they had, and maybe that is what all forbidden places reveal in one form or another, not just what we fear, but how every era builds its own bridge between experience and meaning, between what kills us and what we call it. What if one of Earth's strangest worlds was not hidden on another planet, but sealed beneath our feet all along? In southeastern Romania, near the Black Sea, workers drilling in the 1980s broke through into a chamber no human eyes were meant to find. Below them was Movile Cave, isolated from the surface for roughly 5.5 million years. It was not a cavern of glittering beauty or cathedral-like stone. It was something far more unsettling and far more remarkable. A self-contained world, breathing a chemistry almost hostile to our own. The air inside is thick with gases that would make ordinary breathing dangerous. Oxygen is scarce. Hydrogen sulfide and methane linger in concentrations that turn the cave into an environment as alien as it is earthly. To enter, researchers must descend through a narrow shaft and move with extraordinary care, not only for their own safety, but for the survival of what lives there. Fewer than 100 people have ever been allowed inside. In a century obsessed with access, that number feels almost impossible. Yet the true wonder of Movile Cave is not its danger. It is its independence from sunlight. Life there did not build itself around the sunlit logic that governs forests, fields, and oceans. Instead, microorganisms draw energy from chemical reactions, forming the base of a food web unlike almost anything else on Earth. Above them lives a hidden population of creatures shaped by darkness, pale insects, blind spiders, translucent scavengers, animals so specialized they seem to belong to another chapter of creation. It is tempting to describe a place like this as lost, but perhaps it was never lost at all. It was simply uninterrupted. For millions of years, evolution continued there without us, without our noise, our industries, our bacteria, our assumptions about what life requires. That may be why the cave is so tightly protected. One careless visit could contaminate an ecosystem that took geological time to become itself. And so Movile Cave leaves us with a quiet, astonishing thought. Life may be far more adaptable than our imagination once allowed. It may bloom in poison, in darkness, in isolation. Which means the boundaries we draw around the possible are often less about nature's limits than our own. What does isolation do to life when there is no escape, no interruption, and no reason for nature to be gentle? Off the coast of Brazil, beyond the familiar brightness of beaches and crowded shorelines, there is an island that seems to belong less to human geography than to an older, harsher logic. Ilha da Queimada Grande, known more widely as Snake Island, rises from the Atlantic with dense vegetation, steep rocks, and a reputation so severe that it hardly needs embellishment. People are not welcome there, not because of politics or secrecy, but because survival itself becomes uncertain the moment one steps ashore. The island is home to the golden lancehead viper, a species found nowhere else on Earth. Thousands of them live within that small patch of land, shaped by a history that began when rising seas cut the island off from the Brazilian mainland. Separated from the world they once shared, the snakes adapted to what remained. With little prey except migratory birds, they evolved venom of extraordinary efficiency, a biological answer to an unforgiving environment. On that island, hesitation meant hunger. Precision meant life. It is easy to hear a story like this and reduce it to fear. But fear alone misses something important. Snake Island is not monstrous. It is simply concentrated nature, stripped of sentiment and left to refine itself without human interference. The danger comes not from malice, but from perfection. An organism isolated long enough becomes exquisitely tuned to the rules of its own small world. That is one reason access is so restricted. The island threatens us, yes, but we also threaten it. Human arrival has a way of changing whatever it touches, sometimes through violence, sometimes through carelessness, sometimes just through presence. A place this singular can be damaged as easily as it can harm. And maybe that is the deeper unease Snake Island stirs in us. It reminds us that the planet was never built for our comfort alone. There are still corners of Earth where evolution speaks in a voice untouched by human preference, places where life has written its own terms and kept them. To stand before such a place, even from a distance, is to remember that nature does not exist to welcome us. Sometimes it simply exists, complete without us. Can a place remain private in an age when almost nothing else does? In the Hawaiian archipelago, where tourism has long reshaped the rhythm of land and sea, there is one inhabited island that still stands apart from the modern appetite for access. Niihau lies west of Kauai, sunlit and windswept, close enough to be seen from the air, and yet impossibly distant in every other way. No resorts rise from its shoreline. No crowds arrive with cameras and itineraries. For most people, the island remains not a destination, but a horizon. That separation began in the 19th century when the island passed into private ownership. Since then, generations of the same family have controlled entry with unusual consistency. Only residents, relatives, invited guests, certain officials, and limited personnel are generally allowed to land there. The restriction has helped preserve a way of life that feels almost unimaginable in the contemporary world. The community is small, largely self-contained, and shaped by rhythms that answer more to place than to global fashion. From a distance, it is tempting to romanticize such isolation, to imagine Niihau as a perfect refuge untouched by time. But real places are more complicated than symbols. Privacy protects, yet it also separates. Continuity preserves, yet it can require boundaries that outsiders may never fully understand. What endures on Niihau is not simply an untouched landscape, but a deliberate choice about who gets to participate in it. That choice can feel unusual because modern culture tends to treat openness as a default good. We assume that places should be shared, photographed, reviewed, and made available. Niihau suggests another possibility, that a community may have the right to remain partially unread by the outside world. Not secret exactly, just self-determined. There is dignity in that. In a century that turns so much of life into spectacle, the island offers a quieter principle. Not everything meaningful must become public to be real. Not every shore must become a product. Sometimes preservation is not about freezing the past. It is about refusing to surrender every corner of existence to visibility. And perhaps that is why Niihau lingers in the imagination. It is not merely closed, it is intact. A reminder that in some rare places, the world still belongs first to the people who live there, not to those who wish to consume it. What happens when a mountain stops being a landscape and becomes a question no one is allowed to answer? In the southern Ural Mountains of Russia, Mount Yamantau rises with the same ancient indifference as any other peak. From a distance, it appears almost ordinary. Stone, forest, weather, silence. But around it, the details begin to shift. Roads lead where few civilian routes should. Structures appear without explanation. Security closes in. The mountain remains on the map, yet whatever is inside it belongs to another category entirely. Rumor, strategy, suspicion. Construction in the area intensified during the final decades of the Cold War, a period when governments learned to build not only weapons, but continuities, backup worlds beneath the visible one. Analysts have long speculated that Yamantau conceals an immense underground complex, perhaps a command center designed to endure the unthinkable, perhaps a shelter for state operations after nuclear devastation, perhaps something else altogether. Official explanations have varied over time, and that inconsistency has only deepened the mystery. A place described too many ways often begins to sound like it is being described around, rather than directly. What makes a site like this so compelling is not simply secrecy, it is scale. To hollow out a mountain or fortify its interior is to act on a very specific belief, that catastrophe is possible, maybe even probable. and that survival belongs to those who prepare in silence. These are structures built from distrust of the surface world. They assume that what is visible can be destroyed, interrupted, erased. And yet there is a strange melancholy in that logic. The same species that writes symphonies, paints ceilings, and sends telescopes into deep space also buries itself in reinforced stone, planning for the day everything above ground fails. Mount Yamantau, whether bunker or symbol, reflects that dual nature. We are imaginative enough to foresee disaster and disciplined enough to engineer for it, but never quite wise enough to stop being haunted by our own capacity for ruin. So the mountain stays closed, guarded by distance and force, offering no clear confession. And perhaps that is why it remains so powerful in the imagination. Not because we know what is hidden there, but because we recognize the instinct that may have built it. When people carve survival into the earth itself, what they reveal is not only fear of enemies, but fear of history, and of how quickly a civilization can disappear from the surface and continue underground as memory, command, and ash. What if the most important frontier on Earth lies not across an ocean or beyond the clouds, but under miles of ice where no human being can simply walk? In East Antarctica, beneath a frozen expanse that seems almost beyond time, Lake Vostok waits in darkness. It is buried under more than 2 miles of ice, sealed away from the open world for millions of years. Above it, the surface is brutal beyond ordinary language. Temperatures so low they defy intuition. Winds that erase scale, months of unbroken night. Nothing about this place invites us in, and yet that is precisely why science has been drawn to it with such patience and caution. Lake Vostok is extraordinary, not only because it exists, but because it may have remained isolated since long before human beings learned to speak, farm, or imagine the poles at all. A body of water held in suspension beneath an ice sheet, protected by pressure and time, untouched by weather, commerce, or history. To reach it without contaminating it has required one of the most delicate balancing acts in modern exploration. The challenge is not merely to arrive, it is to arrive without destroying the very mystery one hopes to understand. Why does that matter so much? Because a place like Lake Vostok is more than a lake, it is a model of possibility. If life has endured there in extreme isolation, then the definition of habitable space becomes far larger than we once believed. The lake begins to resemble a mirror held up to worlds beyond Earth. Hidden oceans beneath the icy crusts of distant moons, environments where sunlight never enters, and yet chemistry may still support living systems. That possibility changes the emotional scale of the story. Suddenly, this silent Antarctic chamber is no longer only a remote scientific site. It becomes a rehearsal for one of humanity's oldest questions. Are we alone? The answer may not come as a signal from the stars. It may begin as a microbial trace in water no one was ever meant to see. And still, the ice holds most of its silence. Samples are few. Interpretations remain careful. The truth is still emerging, slowly, under strict protocols and enormous restraint, which may be fitting. Some discoveries should not be rushed. Some doors, once open, ask us to become more responsible than curious. Lake Vostok reminds us that mystery is not always hiding in the unreachable. Sometimes it is waiting beneath our certainty, asking whether we are wise enough to approach the unknown without overwhelming it the moment we arrive. What kind of secret survives not in a locked box, but in miles of paper, ink, and guarded memory? Inside Vatican City, beyond the public grandeur of domes, courtyards, and ceremonial stone, there is another kind of architecture. One built not upward, but inward. Shelves stretch through controlled rooms and restricted corridors, carrying centuries in the form of letters, decrees, petitions, trial records, diplomatic exchanges, and private appeals. This is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, one of the most protected collections of documents in the world, where history is not buried so much as carefully withheld. The imagination tends to fill such a place with dramatic fantasies, as though secrecy itself must point to scandal or revelation. But the truth is in some ways more powerful. Archives are not treasure chests. They are reservoirs of human intention. They preserve the language of faith, ambition, conflict, doubt, and administration across generations. Here, the lives of popes, scholars, monarchs, artists, and dissenters pass one another in silence. each document carrying the atmosphere of its own era. Access is possible, but only in narrow and highly controlled ways. Qualified researchers may request specific materials. They may study under supervision. But they do not wander freely through the stacks, and vast portions remain closed by policy or time. That structure creates a peculiar emotional effect. The archive is neither fully inaccessible nor truly open. It exists in a middle ground where knowledge is acknowledged, rationed, and staged. There is something revealing in that arrangement. We often imagine history as a finished story waiting to be read, but archives remind us that the past is never encountered whole. It arrives through selection, permission, survival, and interpretation. What remains preserved is not everything that happened. It is what was written down, what endured, and what institutions chose to keep. That may be why the Vatican archive exerts such a hold on the modern imagination. Not merely because of what is known to be there, but because of what any archive quietly teaches us. That memory and power have always been intertwined. To preserve a document is one act. To control access to it is another. And so the rooms remain cool, ordered, and mostly unseen. A civilization speaking to itself across centuries, in voices that are sometimes public, sometimes intimate, and sometimes still waiting for the right century to listen. The deeper question is not only what secrets remain inside, but whether history itself is ever something we uncover completely, or only something we approach, page by page, through the narrow light we are allowed to carry. What do these closed places have in common, beyond the fences, the guards, the ice, the rituals, and the warning signs? At first glance, very little. A fragile stone arch in Europe does not resemble an Arctic seed vault. A sacred shrine in Japan does not resemble a toxic cave in Romania. A privately held island in Hawaii seems to belong to a different moral universe than a secretive mountain complex in Russia. And yet, taken together, these places begin to form a pattern. Each one marks a boundary around something considered irreducible, something too delicate, too dangerous, too sacred, too historically charged, or too consequential to be treated casually. That pattern tells us something important about human civilization. We do not only build roads, museums, and institutions to increase access, we also create limits. We decide again and again that some things require distance. A species often described as relentlessly expansionist also understands, at crucial moments, the ethics of restraint. We close off a cave to protect an ecosystem. We restrict a shrine to preserve reverence. We seal an archive because knowledge itself can be powerful, political, and unfinished. Of course, boundaries are never neutral. They can protect, but they can also exclude. They can preserve meaning, but they can also intensify myth. The line between stewardship and control is not always easy to see. Every forbidden place contains that tension. Is the barrier there to defend life, memory, and dignity? Or does it also defend status, authority, and ownership? Often the answer is both. That ambiguity is part of what keeps these places alive in the imagination. We are drawn not only to what is hidden, but to the reasoning behind the hiding. We want to know whether the closed door is an act of care or fear, wisdom or power. In that sense, forbidden places are never merely geographic. They are philosophical. They ask who gets to decide what the public may touch, study, inherit, or even witness. And perhaps that is why they linger with us long after the map is folded away. Each one becomes a mirror, not just of what the world contains, but of what we believe should remain protected from human hunger, and what that belief reveals about the kind of civilization we are still trying to become. What if the deepest reason we keep searching for forbidden places is not to conquer them, but to measure ourselves against their silence? By the time we have stood at the edge of these stories, before the crumbling arch, the sealed cave, the mountain bunker, the hidden shrine, the vault of seeds, the buried lake, we begin to notice something unexpected. The real drama is not only in the places themselves. It is in the human response they provoke: curiosity, awe, suspicion, reverence, a longing to cross the line, and an uneasy recognition that perhaps the line is there for a reason. Forbidden places challenge one of our oldest instincts, the belief that to know something, we must enter it fully. But many of the most meaningful realities in life do not work that way. Love cannot be dissected without losing something essential. Memory cannot be forced to tell the whole truth at once. Sacredness fades when turned into spectacle. Even science at its best understands that observation must sometimes proceed with humility, because the act of looking can change the thing being seen. So these places begin to feel less like withheld destinations and more like lessons in proportion. They remind us that the world is not simply raw material for experience. Some landscapes are older than our ambitions. Some ecosystems are more delicate than our curiosity is disciplined. Some records of the past are so dense with consequences that opening them requires patience, method, and moral care. The closed gate, in that sense, is not always an insult. Sometimes it is an invitation to maturity. This may be why mystery still matters in a culture built on instant revelation. We are surrounded by images, feeds, archives, and access points, yet we remain spiritually hungry. Perhaps because endless visibility does not automatically produce meaning. Sometimes meaning arrives through what resists us, through what cannot be possessed on demand, through what asks us to pause and consider whether our desire to know is equal to our responsibility to understand. And so, before the final chapter closes, one thought remains. Maybe the world's forbidden places are not simply keeping us out. Maybe they are asking us a harder question first. When the door finally opens, what kind of witness will we be? In the end, the world's most forbidden places do not simply tell us where we cannot go. They tell us who we are when we arrive at a limit. Across continents and centuries, the pattern repeats. A natural wonder is closed so beauty can survive a little longer. A vault is sealed because famine, war, and climate may one day ask humanity to begin again. A shrine remains hidden because reverence is protected not through display, but through distance. A cave is guarded because life there evolved without us and could be undone by a single careless intrusion. A mountain holds its silence because governments prepare for futures they do not trust. An archive preserves memory in measured light, revealing history only through discipline and permission. Beneath Antarctic ice, a lake waits as both scientific frontier and cosmic metaphor, reminding us that some of the greatest discoveries begin in environments almost too delicate to touch. Taken together, these places form more than a catalog of restriction. They become a portrait of civilization itself, its fears, its hopes, its rituals, its survival instincts, its uneasy relationship with knowledge. We are a species that longs to open every door. But we are also a species learning again and again that wisdom is not the same as access. To reach something is not always to deserve it. To uncover something is not always to understand it. That is the quiet truth running beneath every chapter of this journey. Mystery is not merely the absence of information. Sometimes it is a form of protection. Sometimes it is an ethical boundary. Sometimes it is the last remaining space where wonder can exist without immediately being consumed. And so perhaps the final question is not what still remains hidden on Earth. Perhaps it is whether we can become the kind of people who know how to stand before the unknown with restraint, humility, and care. Because the future of knowledge may depend not only on what we discover next, but on what we choose, with full awareness, to leave undisturbed.